My name is Morgan Everett. I am currently a political science major, and I chose to talk about the end of nuclear warfare because it is a crucial issue today in America. We do not use nuclear warfare even though we were the first to use it in World War II, but the end of it started with Japan. This topic was very important to me because I feel like ending nuclear warfare was crucial in continuing international relations around the world. Throughout my project, I plan to talk about the relationship between Japan and America, and I will talk about how Japan rose to power and became such a strong force over in the Asian Pacific. Next, I will talk about the events of the war that changed the world forever. This war was so bloody and so violent that it made everyone change their mind about the war tactics that are used. And lastly, I'll talk about the post World War changes, the treaties and different rules that were created after such a devastating war. Japan began their rise to power in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. They began to modernize, and sovereign power became their main goal. The emperor has complete control over the military, and they began to do a draft for the men so they could always have a standing army. When they started to realize having an army was the key to having power, the emperor changed the rules to universal conscription so they could create a citizen army. This army was created against the citizens' consent. But there was limited voting rights in Japan, so no one could really stick up and say anything about the changes that were being made. They began their expansion into the surrounding areas, and they prepared their forces so they could defeat different powers. They eventually annexed Korea and started to take over areas like China and Russia. The former president thought that the US would eventually become a part of this growing problem, and eventually we did, but when this all started, we remained neutral. Japan's expansion into the surrounding counties did not raise any red flags at first because the US was not affected. But once Japan decided they wanted to expand into Australia, which was then called Oceania, they had to step in. They have many raw materials that would have helped them with their plan to take over the world. The world powers responded with an embargo on oil. They refused to give Japan any oil so that then they would eventually run out of oil for their planes and boats. They could not place any more attacks without a sufficient amount of oil. The Japanese planned to take over an aviation base in the French Indo area to prepare for battle. This is when the US decided they had to come out of their neutral stance, with Japan collecting all of their resources to make a large attack. The US decided that it was time to break their neutral stance. They entered World War II after these actions. Pearl Harbor. The US decided to enter World War II before Pearl Harbor even occurred. But December 7, 1941, the Japanese planned a surprise attack on the United States once they received word that the US was entering the war. They wanted to get the upper hand and make an attack before the US could attack them. But the Japanese soldiers were not trained well, so the attack did not go as well as planned. Their pilots lost control and they only hit 5 out of 16 of the planned targets. 3,700 American lives were lost. Less than 100 of those lives were civilian lives, and the other were military personnel. This had a large impact on American people, and it was definitely an act of war. The United States did not take this attack lightly, and they planned their revenge, and it was one of the largest acts of war ever. The next move that the United States made changed the way that we uh, use weapons in war. Hiroshima. This is where the first atomic bomb in history was ever dropped. This is the most controversial act of war in history. This bomb was called the Little Boy. It had one of the highest casualty rates of 237,000 people who died. Many civilians faced health issues even after the bomb dropped in the months after. They faced burns, radiation sickness, and cancer. Many lost many members of their family that day that the bomb dropped and were left without a home or family. The town was in ruins and completely devastated. Now, this bomb was very controversial because of the amount of civilians that were killed. But I do agree, no one knows what the correct move could have been years ago or whether or not the war would have just continued and more lives would have been lost. I think that what made everyone so apprehensive about the use of atomic bomb was the fact that no one knew anything about it, and it was also just such a large-scale attack that no one was prepared for the amount of damage that was done. This was the first ever use of nuclear weapons in war, and no one knew how destructive it could actually be. Unfortunately, Hiroshima was an example of why we shouldn't use nuclear warfare. So many faced the devastation of war that were not involved in their country's political actions. A medical doctor on the scene commented and said, "Nothing remained except for a few buildings of reinforced concrete. For acres and acres of the city was like a desert, except for the scattered piles of brick and roof tile. I had to revise my meaning of the word destruction, or choose some other word to describe what I saw. Devastation may be a better word, but really, I know of no other words to describe the view." These are words from someone on the ground that day. And what these people saw on the ground and the aftermath and videos of what was done really changed everyone's perception of nuclear weapons. They were no longer a normal weapon. There was no words for the destruction that these weapons caused. The next move the US made may have been where they made a mistake. In Nagasaki, they dropped another atomic bomb. Even after all of the damage done from the first one, they did not believe that Japan would step down. And even now, we don't know whether or not Japan would have ended the war after just being bombed once by a nuclear weapon. But August 9th, 1945, Fat Man was dropped. The skies were cloudy and the pilots could not see their original target, much like Pearl Harbor. They don't have a lot of the technology we have today, so they couldn't hit their original target, so they had to hit a civilian city. The city was evacuated because it had been involved in warfare before, and they were nervous that they may be hit, so at least there were less civilian casualties. The original plan was to hit where they held all the ammunition used for their war, but the pilots couldn't find it, so they had to drop the bomb in Nagasaki. There were 80,000 casualties, but not as many civilian casualties, fortunately. This is also why the US became so highly feared. They dropped not one, but 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The damage from atomic bombs is probably the most devastating. And someone on the ground commented and said, "All the buildings I could see were on fire. Electricity poles were wrapped in flames like so many pieces of kindling. It seemed as if the earth itself was emitting fire and smoke that writhed up and erupted from underground. The sky was dark and the ground was scarlet, and in between the clouds hung yellowish smoke. 3 kinds of color, black, yellow, and scarlet, loomed ominously over the people who ran about like so many ants seeking to escape. It seemed like the end of the world. If nuclear bombs were continued to be used, we would end the world. If every city was devastated like this every time there was a conflict, we would destroy every major city in warfare. And that's why so many things changed after these atomic bombs were dropped. No one had ever seen devastation like this ever before. The fighting ended August 14th, 1945, but the battle wasn't over here. The United States dropping these atomic bombs started an ethical negotiation that changed the way we use nuclear warfare. The second bomb hitting Japan made them raise the white flag. Many believe that without the second atomic bomb, they would have continued to fight and just accepted the loss of the city of Hiroshima. But we'll never know that. That can't be proven with the information we have today. Once the world saw the aftermath of the two atomic bombs, they decided nuclear warfare is much too harsh. When the pictures leaked to the public of the ruined towns, the sick children, and dead civilians, everyone began to take a second look at the way we use nuclear weapons. The world began a period of change. I think even the US realized that the dropping of the atomic bombs was way more devastating than they could have ever expected. This was technically a test run since it was the first ever nuclear weapon used in warfare. So after the war, the US kept their troops there to help the citizens of Japan rebuild and reconnect their country. The emperor had total power during this war. The citizens had no part in whether or not they wanted to fight or not, they were forced to. So, when the US sent General Douglas MacArthur, they had the general theme was pacifism. They created a new constitution that focused on human rights, suffrage for all, and pacifism for conflicts with other world powers. Japan began to change, and the people of Japan started to gain their lives back. I think it is crucial that the US stayed and tried to fix their mistakes after dropping the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs may have been overboard, but at least it brought about a period of change for the citizens of Japan. They could start a new leaf where their leader did not have complete control to start a world war. Japan and the US weren't the only ones involved in these changes. They weren't the only ones involved in World War II, and after all the devastation, everyone wanted to get together and change the way they handled their conflicts. The wars had high casualties and high prices, so they created the United Nations. The United Nations was created so they could negotiate, talk, and all the countries could be connected to maybe work out their problems before it ended in nuclear warfare. Later on in the late 1900s, they created the Treaty of Nonproliferation of nuclear weapons. And this just means that everyone has to tell each country how many nuclear weapons they have. They are not allowed to be used in small scale conflicts, and they're basically just banned. Many large powers do have nuclear weapons, but they are not used in everyday conflicts. This was the era of pacifism and negotiations. People began to talk, make treaties, make agreements, and make trades to come to an equal decision. The ban of nuclear weapons was a direct result of the nuclear warfare between Japan and the United States. I believe that this warfare may not have been good, and the loss of lives is always bad, But if we did not know how bad nuclear weapons were, they would still be being used today in everyday warfare. Civilians would die within every conflict. There are civilian lives still lost in warfare, but not at such a large scale as when the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan. I hope that we can ban nuclear weapons and they will not be used ever in warfare. This conflict was such a large scale devastation of two major cities, but it made us change the way we think. And that's important because we all make mistakes, and now we know that nuclear warfare is not okay to use in everyday conflicts between countries. The conflict between Japan and America set the tone for how we handle our problems today. There has not been such a large scale use of nuclear weapons since the attack in Japan, and we can thank the US and all these treaties created after for that